and welcome to biology. So we're going to start chapter 1 out with an introduction to life. What is biology? Bio actually means, hold on, let's get my pen working, Bio actually means life. And logi is study of. Study of life. The thing about the study of life in biology is it's actually a very diverse field. We're going to look at quite a few different rankings of that field, and one of the first things we're going to do is start by classifying it. That means separating out the things that are very tiny from the things that are much larger. Some general themes that we're going to look at are common properties that all forms of life share. It helps us classify them as being forms of life. And we're also going to look at how we study forms of life. There are specific rules to it. Let's look at how we organize and rank different forms of life or different properties of living things. One of the ways we can do it is by size and inclusion, exclusion. Here's a list of 13 items. It might be a little bit different depending on which textbook you're deciding to use, but generally it means that we've gone from small, very small, atoms are very small, to very large. The most inclusive things are the largest, and the most exclusive items are the smallest. Here's a visual example we'll use. It starts at the largest and the smallest. The biosphere is the largest concept. So a biosphere is all of the spaces where life can be found. Life can actually be found pretty high up in the sky, actually. Mostly these are single-celled organisms, prokaryotes, and also very, very deep within the earth. Places like the Mariana Trench or deep within caves. These are also usually prokaryotes. In the middle layers, we see larger organisms, such as us, and in this case, flocks of birds on the beach. When we look at specific areas, let's see if we have it better. There we go. When we look at specific areas of the biosphere, we can find different groups there. These groups are known as ecosystems, and an ecosystem includes the non-living components, such as the water out here in the background, the sky, and the sand on the beach. So living and non-living components. The next rank is the community. So now that's all the organisms, so everything that's alive on that beach. So it means all the birds, all the all the clams, all of the worms, all the fish, but it means that we're not including things like the sand and the water and the sky, the non-living components. We also have populations. Now you can see this is a mixed group of birds here, little white seagulls. You also see these big brown pelicans. I'm sure there's fish and plants and all sorts of other organisms in that community. But when we take it out and look at just who's breeding, in this case, just the pelicans, this is the population. So these are the ones who will share genetic lineage, oftentimes considered a species. A single organism, here let's flip to the next page, I think ever. Oh, sorry, we'll do some definitions. Okay, biosphere. So that's all the environments on Earth that support life. An ecosystem, all of the organisms living within a particular area, and the physical components with which the organisms interact, like the sand, rocks, non-living components. The community are all of the different types of organisms or the array of organisms that are living in a particular ecosystem, such as the white birds and the pelicans and the grasses and the fish. But then a population are all the individuals of a specific species, right? So everyone who's breeding together or can exchange genes living in that particular area. So you can have brown pelicans on one beach, say in the Americas, and another brown pelican group somewhere else, say off Madagascar. But if they cannot meet each other, then they can't breed, and so they are separate and distinct populations. So there's that. An organism is an individual living thing. here's our organism. Just that one pelican, just like Sam the pelican, right? Even though he's a member of a population, we're just looking at Sam. So the next one that we look at for us, so these are for multicellular organisms. Organisms like humans and dogs, larger ones, we call them multicellular. We'll delve into what that means in later lectures, but for right now, just kind of think of it as animals and plants. So these multicellular organisms tend to have organ systems, right? So that would be the nervous system or circulatory system, respiratory system, groups of organs that work together to execute a specific function within that organism. Then we look at specific organs, right? In this case, although an organ system such as the nervous system includes the spinal cord and peripheral nerves, we're also just looking at the single one, the brain. Within the brain, there are multiple types of tissue, right? As is with all organs, most organs. And in this case, the nervous tissue is what we're looking for. Then we get down to the idea of the cell. Now, this is another important rank, right? So right here is the cell. Some organisms are only one cell big, and they're not multicellular. Those are things like bacteria, some fungi, and we'll look at some more of those later on. But when we're looking at multicellular organisms like humans and pelicans, a cell is a part of the tissue, okay? So it's a single, most fundamental unit of life. It's the building blocks, the Legos of life. Inside of all of these little cells are these little dots you can see here, or extensions, these processes. So these are known as organelles. So they're just like what they sound like. They're kind of like the organs of a cell, only they're made out of usually membranes and proteins instead of entire groups of other cells. So they're an organelle. They're smaller. We get now to some very tiny parts of living things, such as the molecules. A molecule is a group of atoms, more than one at least, stuck together. And an atom is the smallest unit that we are classifying. So we don't do subatomic particles. We do atoms specifically. Like we're looking at a little hydrogen right here. So organism, an individual living thing, right? Sam the pelican. An organ system, several organs that cooperate. So in this one, we're looking at the nervous system. So multiple organs. An organ, a single structure, and it's composed of multiple tissues, and it provides specific function for the organ system in the organism. Now we have tissues, so these are a group of similar cells. Okay, they usually perform a very specific function within the organ. Then finally we have cells, the fundamental unit of life, the building block. Organelles are like organs for cells. They're usually membrane bound. A molecule is more than one atom held together. So a cluster of atoms. And the atom is the fundamental unit of all of this. So this is the teeny tiny building block of all matter. Now let's classify living things. Another way, taxonomy. So taxonomy is the way that we systematically name organisms, and it allows us to kind of order them based on this important idea of relatedness. Here's one way we can do it. So this is grouping organisms by relatedness using what we call the family tree of all living things. This is a really cool tree. So we started doing this phylogenetic tree a couple hundred years ago with the help of Carl Linnaeus. So what ended up happening is most of what we grouped different organisms by were similar structures. So if you had wings, maybe you were a bird, for example. However, after about the year 2000 and beyond, we've been sequencing like crazy. So we've been able to actually look at the DNA to see how we could structure this. And we were able to put together 3 main branches: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya of life. And so here's a common ancestor down here. Eukarya and archaea we found were most closely related. which some people felt was a little bit of a surprise. But it does include the extremophiles, so that makes sense. Here's where we live, right here on that tiny branch. That's Animalia. So for example, one of the things that helped us clear up some of these inconsistencies of classification were, remember when I said some animals have wings, so they should be grouped together? Well, what about bats and birds? They're both animals with wings. Well, we know now that bats are more similar to humans. They are mammals, and birds are far different. So some of these structures are just convergent. It's a good thing we have that DNA to tell us. So let's look at how it works in terms of naming. This is what we call the binomial nomenclature system. So bi meaning two, names, and then a name clade. So we're going to use two names, a genus and a species. There's genus and species. To help us organize everybody into how inclusive or exclusive a category they belong. So up here we have Animalia, right? Let me actually make some space. A little space. Guess I need a bigger eraser. Okay, there we go. All right, Kingdom Animalia. This is the most inclusive one for everything that's an animal. So everything from worms to fish to dogs to elephants, everybody gets thrown in there, including humans. And now we're going to exclude a few. We're going to use phylum, Chordata. So everybody who has a spinal cord gets to stay in. So everyone with this backbone. So that does include fish and elephants and otters and foxes and wolves and dogs. But you know who doesn't have one? Earthworms. So they get kicked out. The next one we look at is Mammalia. This is the class level. So everybody who has fur on their body and uses milk to feed their young gets included. And then kicks out the fish right away. No milk or fur there. It continues on until we get to this genus species level. Genus species is right here. That's the name. It's kind of like a first and a last name for a particular group of breeding organisms. I know this isn't the best one to use, but it's kind of an interesting example. We were wondering for the longest time what made a dog from a wolf. What were the big genetic changes? And it turned out it was regulation. It's kind of an interesting story. Now we know they're not different species. Part of the reason, too, people argue is because wolves and dogs can interbreed. But we still classify them this way, possibly because they're on a specific evolutionary trajectory. So we just looked at binomial nomenclature. So it's the genus and the species of the first and last name, right? For example, here's one that we all share, Staphylococcus aureus. Now, there are many different types of Staphylococcus, but we want to talk about a specific one. We use the species name, aureus. We also usually use italics. Sometimes you can underline it, but oftentimes it's italicized. And so genus name is capitalized, and the species name is lowercase. Here's some common features of living organisms. So another list includes things that all living organisms have to have in order to be called a living organism. The first thing is they all need DNA. The second, they need to all be at least one or more cell big. Third is they need to be able to grow in either size or number. 4 is they must have a metabolism or be able to convert chemical energy from food or for storage. They must be able to regulate their internal environment. That's called homeostasis. They have to be able to respond to their environment, swim away if it's a bad chemical or too much light, and swim towards if they find food. They must reproduce, either in size or in number. And they must be able to both evolve and adapt. So that's it for our first lecture. This was a little on the long side. There are a couple more that'll be about this long. But please go ahead and move forward to the next one if you're able to. Email me with any questions you might have. Thanks a lot.